Every child is thinking these same thoughts. And this is what, as adoptive parents, we have to normalize and accept and actually welcome. Who am I? Where did I come from? What is my creation story? Who are my birth parents? Who do I look like?
This is A Joyful Rebellion, the podcast that explores that moment you realize the life and success you worked so hard to create didn't come with all the fulfillment you thought it would. I'm your host, James Walters, and I want you to be the author of your own story. Each week, I connect with people who inspire bold answers to the question, what do I do now to create a life I love? If you're ready to start answering that question for yourself, you're in the right place. So let's start a joyful rebellion. What if the story of adoption wasn't just about a child finding a family, but also about loss, identity, and healing? That's what today's guest, Anna Maria DiDio, wants families to understand. Anna Maria is an adoptive mother, author, and advocate who shares real, unfiltered stories about adoption, both the joys and the struggles. Her memoir, Love at the Border, an adoption adventure, and her life adventure children's book series help families navigate the complexities of adoption with honesty and compassion. In this episode, we explore what Anna Maria calls the myth of adoption, the emotional impact of separation, and how adoptive families can better support their children in understanding where they come from. Anna Maria also shares how writing and storytelling became her way of helping others facing similar journeys. If you're an adoptive parent considering adoption or simply curious about the realities behind the process, this episode is full of valuable insights and heartfelt stories you won't want to miss. Anna Maria DiDio, thank you for being here on our Joyful Rebellion today.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to talk with you because you've got a great story. About 20-ish years ago, right? You began a journey.
Yes.
And you began that journey, I would imagine, full of hope and optimism, and things were going to be fantastic. And then you started getting, like so many things in life, you started getting into it. And when you thought you had accomplished the goal, then there were a lot of learning curves that you experienced. So I don't want to give away what was going on. I'm going to let you take it from there. People are listening thinking, oh my gosh, what am I about to hear? But it's a fascinating story. And I think everyone who listens to our show is really going to get a lot out of this conversation.
Like many adoption stories, it began with some infertility issues. So we addressed those. Nothing was happening. So we set out on the path of adoption, because we wanted to have a family. And as soon as we fully immersed ourselves on that path, I got pregnant. We had a beautiful baby girl, but then adding to our family was impossible. The infertility issues sort of continued, and we set out on the path of adoption again. And we looked into lots of things, but through happenstance, we just heard about an organization that was sending children to a summer camp in our area. And these children were from Mexico, from different orphanages in Mexico. And at the bottom of the article, it said, these children are available for adoption. So years had passed, and our daughter was by that point 5, 6 years old. And we thought, well, we wanted the girls to be closer in age, and the time for an infant had passed us by. So we investigated this organization and did all the paperwork. And oh my goodness, it was probably 2 years later, we were invited to meet a 6-year-old girl in Cuernavaca, Mexico.
So yeah, it was not a quick couple of forms.
Right.
Yeah. Wow. So you already had the daughter that you didn't think you could have when you began your research. Then you did want to expand your family and saw this as an option. And obviously there are a lot of paperwork hurdles. If you're adopting internationally, then there are even more, I'm guessing.
Yes.
What was that like?
Well, I mean, a word, terrifying. I mean, this is something that we didn't imagine for our family. And the first trip was sort of, see if you like this arrangement, see if you can bond together as a family. So our whole family went, and we had a day of play and a day of just talking through translators and things. So then we were ahead with it. But it was, the questions that you're asking yourself, it was we're in the midst of another country and in a language we don't speak. Can I love this child? What is this adoption going to be like? But after we met her and saw her personality and had actually a wonderful 2 days, we were very confident in this solution for our family, confident that we would go forward with the adoption. And we did. So a year after that,
Wow.
she was cleared, declared an orphan, and then was sent to live with us. And then we returned twice to Mexico with her to finalize the adoption. The rules are different now, but that was our process.
So it's a pretty lengthy all the way around, a lot of going back and forth. And when you had those 2 days, everything seemed great and you guys really wanted to add to your family. What happened when she was finally with you and the days started to be kind of just normal days?
Right. Well, on the summer program that I mentioned, in her mind, she thought she was coming just for the summer. And so even though the agency and the shelter and the people there said that they were transparent and told her what would be happening, when she realized she would be living with us and staying with us, she cried for months. It was, this is often referred to as the myth of adoption, in that it is a very simple and straightforward family solution. And that's the reason why I dove into this whole writing career, because it took me really too long to realize that every adoption begins with trauma. So as I was interacting with her, having her part of our family and seeing how she was relating to us and how difficult it was, I don't think we had a real appreciation I know we did not have a real appreciation for all that she had lost. Coming here, yes, of course, she has a family, but her culture, foods, the taste, the smells, the caregivers, all that disappeared, in a blink for her. The orphanage was not some cold and unwelcome place. It was filled with wonderful women that cared for these children just beautifully. And, she missed those folks. So it was really a process. So that was the beginning of many months. It took more than a year. And I was, thinking about this trauma and began to really research it and started going back to my journal and keeping track of what was happening. It wasn't until I retired from corporate life that I went back to the journals and wanted to write all of this down and begin to write the children's books with a message for adoptive families and such.
And you have written several books now, and one of them is called Love at the Border. It's an adoption adventure and memoir. It was the first one that you wrote?
Yes.
Okay.
That was the beginning of the story, from our attempts to have children all the way through to her graduation from college, actually.
Wow. And it's not like you've got a little baby you've brought home and then everything's new to them and they're experiencing life in so many ways for the first time. She was 6 years old. And so that's enough time to really, like you said, have a sense of place, a sense of identity, where even though maybe in your mind, I guess I should say, that wasn't the ideal situation for her, you would think, oh, who would want to grow up in an orphanage instead of being with a loving, caring family? But when she came to live with you and when she realized she was going to be there and that was what life was going to be now, and she spent so many months crying, what did that do to you? Because you cared for her,
Right.
You wanted to do the best thing for her, and how much did that wreck your emotional state?
Well, it was a difficult time, but we were very fortunate in that we lived in a very supportive community and a very small school district. And she really clicked with the ESL teacher. We had assistance from a therapist. We maintained contact with the women from the shelter. So we, tried as many ways as we could. Also, just knowing and feeling that her culture was very important. We tried to keep that front and center in our home. But I say this in my memoir, we could not eat, tacos every single night. And this is part of what I was describing earlier about the trauma. There were so many signs, the temper tantrums, not being truthful with us, like disassociating from the family, and food became a battleground. So all of these things were building and building. And again, when I looked into it and discovered something called the primal wound, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but primal wound is, well, actually, it's a book written by Nancy Verrier, and it refers to the physical separation of the adopted child from the mother. So that's the very first trauma or wound that the child experiences. So when I read the book and began to understand and see all of the behaviors that were present in our home, I thought, well, this is it. I'd like to say we had more understanding, but it was a bit better. We understood. So we did have, as I said, help of professionals along the way. She's a very outgoing and funny and gregarious kid. So she was building friendships at the same time. She lost her Spanish within just a few months.
Wow.
She's fluent again. And that, I think that was just a major step forward for her.
That's great. And during that time when you were realizing all the displays of behavior were really about the trauma, what kinds of things were you writing in your journal at that point?
It's funny. The first, when I referred to the myth of adoption, we think as the family adopting this child that we are just so important and we're just going to make this child's life the most wonderful it's ever been. So we went to one of the back to school nights soon after she began the school year. There was a theme to the artwork that was hanging in the hallway, and it was, draw someone who is most important to you, draw that person. So I was like skipping down the hallway. I couldn't wait to see the big poster of me.
Oh boy.
On the poster board. And I get to the big poster board, and I could see her name clearly at the bottom, but there was a blonde woman who was holding a baby. And it was another one of the teachers that had been out on maternity leave. And she came back to the school to visit, had the baby, and the kids were holding a baby. And think about it. She was at this orphanage where there were so many little kids and babies, and they all helped with the children. And that to her was just such a wonderful experience. And that's what she remembered. And that's what she drew. I was just thinking, well, I better wise up here. And all of that started to really dawn. And that's some of the things that I used to keep track of in my journal. And I wrote about them in the memoir.
That would be a light bulb kind of a moment, and trying to see through her eyes and why that was such a big impact for her. Now, when you've talked to people who have read the memoir and who maybe even been in similar circumstances, what's the feedback? What are things that you guys all have in common? Maybe people who are only 5 years into it, where you're 20 something years into it at this point, right?
You raise a great point, because this is the reason that I wrote the children's books. Every child is thinking these same thoughts. And this is what, as adoptive parents, we have to normalize and accept and actually welcome. Who am I? Where did I come from? What is my creation story? Who are my birth parents? Who do I look like? So these are some of the questions that are in the adopted child's mind that families are a little bit scared to kind of address. But through my books, I'm hoping to encourage those conversations and normalize them, so that there's, on the child side, there's fear of abandonment, losing, the love that they have now in the family. And the parents don't want to acknowledge the birth family. I mean, this is a new family now. Why should we? Both of those sides of the story, if you will, are equally and wonderfully important. They need to be embraced and discussed. And again, I felt those messages were important. So I put together 3 children's books with those themes. The middle book, actually, one of the triggers is putting together a family tree. That was one of my daughter's first assignments when she went to school, and she didn't know anyone in the tree. So,
right.
Parents and teachers need to be sensitive to those triggers. And I write about that in the book called How I Wonder Where You Are.
I see that.
Not about my daughter, but just thinking about my first mother. Is she thinking about me now on my birthday? Those questions that families, as I said, need to embrace, and feel free to to discuss as a family.
I'm looking at the series now. It's called the Life Adventure Series, and LIFE stands for Love Inspires Families Everywhere. And it's 3-book series. This one is written for children, whereas your memoir, that's written for the
Right.
grown-ups,
There you
right?
go. Right. And I started a middle grade series, and that's about a girl who is, well, she has a tough time making friends, but she does make a friend when she moves to a new city, and he's adopted.
Hmm.
And parents wanted a private adoption, so he enlists the help of the main character, her name's Grace, to find his birth mother. So they have a secret adventure. And so this is the first of a series about Grace and it's going to be called the Blended Family series. So there'll be other topics like divorce and stepchildren and other family events.
Well, tell me a couple of stories that stand out to you of maybe emails or feedback you've gotten from any of the books. If some parents have had their children read it, what did that bring about?
Yes.
And people who have read your memoir, what is some of the feedback you've gotten from that?
Well, the most significant and kind of emotional feedback that I've had about the book is that families, I'll say in the adoption community, maybe they have a cousin who's adopted or a sibling, and not having realized that the behaviors they were seeing were the result of trauma. And, parents having such a difficult time integrating a child into the mix. Just the knowledge of that, the realization of that from some of what I've written to me has been very powerful. So it's a message that I think conveyed through the children's books. But for those, I've had wonderful feedback from those in the adopting community and those in women who've had infertility issues and have looked for solutions for their family. So there's a lot of common ground, I guess, for folks that are building a family, and they've appreciated that.
You said every adoption story begins with trauma of some sort. And really, what it begins with is a separation from the mother, which is a big deal no matter what age you are. Even
Correct.
if you're newborn and you haven't even opened your eyes yet, you know something's not right.
Correct.
So there's that piece. How much more complex does it get? And I know you've only done one adoption as a family, and there are a lot of hurdles to jump through if you're adopting someone in the United States from another state. A lot of
Yes.
hurdles, a lot of things that have to happen. But when you go international, you have a completely different culture. You mentioned things about the food, you mentioned the language. How many more levels of complexity does that add to integrating the family and having everyone feel okay at the end of the day?
The real hurdle is, and I've read this many times through other adoption memoirs, some families attempt to just ignore the culture, the child's birth. And I feel that retaining that, emphasizing it, and helping the child understand it are critical to that child's sense of identity and well-being. And too often that's just ignored. Like, oh, you're in the family now, we're in the US or wherever we live. But I read so much about children then trying to discover their roots and their backstory, why they like certain foods. So it's just so important. And our family has benefited so much. We've kept in contact with the women in Mexico to this day. At her school, she was able to do a semester abroad in Mexico. And all of these things have really added to her story in a super positive way. And she's a working professional now and doing really well.
That's great. And every story is wildly different when a child comes into a new family and leaves behind whatever circumstance and community they were in. But for you guys, when did things start to turn around? When did your journal entries become a little less just observing some of the trials that were happening for you and sort of celebrating wins more often than not?
Yeah. It was, I'll say roller coaster because it was not really a point in time. As it turns out, because the girls were so close in age and, kind of competitive, when they get together to this day, there's still, words and clashing. And I don't understand that. But due to her personality and her ability to make friends and be social and the small school district that we lived in, there were many moments of wonderful experiences after a short period of time. It was really the up and down that was very tough. that would sometimes come out of nowhere or sometimes build over the same struggles over rules or food or whatever. But there was not one moment in time where it was just all working together. It really has been inconsistent.
That makes me wonder if your daughter, so you had a daughter before bringing in another daughter into the family. Did you find that she ever felt a little left out?
Oh, yeah. She was an only child for almost 8 years.
Yeah, I get that.
Everything was just her. And so hence, competition and they ended up going to different high schools, which was really a good decision.
So the 3-book series, the Life Adventure series, what age range is that written for?
Age 4 to 8, approximately. Although the concepts around adoption, the trauma and the discussions can happen, even up to age 12. But 4 to 8 is really the picture book range. And then the middle grade series, it's more of a chapter book with a story about, there's more emotional depth and discovery, and the character Grace looking for friendships and helping this adopted friend. That's for 8 to 12 years old.
The series of 3 that you have right now that are more the picture books, that's something that the parent would be reading to their
Yes.
child. What are some of the things you encourage parents to do when they're reading these? Do you encourage them to read them in this order that you've written them?
The first one is called Many People to Love, and that is the story of Carla's adoption from Colombia. So it is the shock of going from a shelter to a home and getting used to living with a family and not with a group of children, and getting used to what it means to have a sister. So there's a lot of family routines I'm trying to integrate into the story. And then the second book, as I mentioned, is more about adoptee and identity. And then the last book is, a hurdle that our daughter faced when she was asked to read aloud in class when her English was just beginning to form. And it's very tough for, if English is not your primary language, to go up in front of your classmates and read, and just how she conquered that. So that book is called Carla the Conqueror.
I'm going to ask you to speak on behalf of your or channel maybe what she might say, but if somebody is out there considering international adoption, what do you think she would? I could ask you what your advice would be, and we'll get to that. But what do you think she would tell them if they're considering looking in another country and perhaps adopting from another culture? Because she's in her mid-20s now, right? She probably has a lot of perspective on it.
Well, now she says she's very, happy for the life that she has. She's immersed in a wonderful career. And I think one of the biggest keys for her was reclaiming her language and maintaining contact with the women who raised her. I'll never forget, on a birthday, I'm going to say it was early teens, one of the caregivers surprised her. They were Facebook friends. So that was another thing that happened. Social media happened. And all of a sudden, she could be in contact with many of the children that were raised or part of the group of children when she was at the orphanage. She had also maintained with one of her primary caregivers. The caregiver had posted photos of her as a baby, as a toddler. He had never seen them. We had never seen them. And so that was just, amazing. And I think we kept in touch with this woman all these years, and whether she had them and didn't realize it or whatever. But that was really, really cool. And the two of them were able to talk because she was beginning to speak Spanish at that point. She turned all of her social media and phone settings to Spanish. And so she was able to really connect with them. So I think it's important, not more important, it's crucial to, maintain that connection and have the adopted child be immersed in their unique identity and have them claim it.
That's really good advice. And if someone is listening right now and they know someone else who is beginning this journey, what are maybe 1 or 2 things that you would do quite differently?
Well, the advice I always give is maintain contact and network and establish a social connection to other families that have adopted. It's always helpful to talk about the issues that you're going through, talk about resources, books, people in the community, helpful events. So we did that to a small extent. I would definitely, and years ago, there was no internet. So I was calling people in the phone book. I think it's super important to do that.
Just get together with people who are doing what you're doing and trying to do and talk about the best ways to
Right.
make
Learn
it
to
happen.
really engage. And that's so possible now there are so many adoption groups on
Mm.
Facebook, in communities. And of course, churches are another good resource for that type of assistance.
What's the best way for people to connect with you and learn about your books, maybe order your books and be able to tell their friends about the work you're doing?
Sure. I have a website. It's amdidio.com. That's amdidio.com. And on the website, if I have a free affirmation sheet for kids. So I was always a big fan of, I've talked a lot today about children's, identity and confidence. And those affirmations, I think, help with that process. There's a sheet that, again, is on my website, and you can see the affirmations that I've listed, write your own, draw your own pictures. Everything is on my website, links to purchase on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever. And also there's contact information. I'd love to hear from folks. I also do book discussion groups and speaking gigs related to adoptions.
This has been such a fun conversation because I talk to people every single week who have been through a major life change. And the reason it's called a joyful rebellion is most of what we talk about is that time in life where you have checked all the boxes, you've done all the things you thought would make you happy and successful. And sometimes they only made you successful in an outward way. And inside you feel like, oh, I don't feel like I'm living all of the life I could. Then they have to figure out what to do next. Sometimes that comes about from a crash of some sort. Things didn't go the way they thought it would. With your case, you were working towards something and then were successful at it, but then realized it was not going to work out exactly the way you thought it was. And then you had to dig in really deep and figure out what was going on, how to make it better. And that was your joyful rebellion. And I love talking with folks who have gone through their own, but also even better if they take what they learned and they can help other people along the way. And that's what you're doing with your book. So thank you for that. And that's why I wanted to have this conversation, because there may be just one person right now who's listening to this and they're like, my friend, whatever the friend's name is, I'm not going to throw a name out there, but they're thinking, oh yeah, she's starting that process now. Her and her partner are doing the research and they need to hear about this. And they maybe need to get your memoir, and that might save them a lot of grief. So thank you for doing what you've done.
Thank you for inviting me.
I will have all of your information in the show notes, and anyone can click at the top of the show notes to get that. And Anna Maria DiDio, thank you so much for being here on A Joyful Rebellion.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for joining me today. And if you have an extra minute, I have a favor to ask. Some of you listen to this show on Apple Podcasts, and a lot of you I talk to are on Spotify or Amazon. I'd love it if you would take just a second to leave a rating or a review. It lets the platforms know that listeners are getting value from the show and suggest it to others who are interested in similar content. And as always, if you have a topic you'd like me to cover, a guest suggestion, or just general feedback, I'd love to hear about that too. Connect with me on Facebook, Instagram, or at ajoyfulrebellion.com.